Hello, everybody. I am back to discuss episode 6 of Paolo Sorrentino's The Young Pope. And while this episode might not have been quite as extraordinary as episode 5 has two major scenes that make it absolutely required viewing, I feel like this is kind of the first episode in the second major story arc of the first season, because it begins 9 months after the seismic changes that occurred in episode 5. So it's a fitting time for it to kind of take a breath and start rebuilding some new storylines, but it was absolutely incredible. If you're not watching this show, I strongly recommend you just go back to episode 1 and work your way forward. Season 2 is on its way. I'm feeling this is going to be one of those shows that for the next couple of years, people continue to rediscover, saying, you know what, I never wanted to watch that show, but I finally took a crack at it, and I'm so glad that I did because it's so well written and so well performed. It has such great music. Everything about it is, you can just use a lot of superlative adjectives, even if on the surface you would think this is not a story that would appeal to you in any way, shape, or form, because I am not interested in sprawling narratives about organized religion, but I'm completely addicted to The Young Pope. It is that good. At any rate, all my gushing aside, let's dig into episode 6. One of the things I love most about the show is how pretty much every episode, Paolo Sorrentino will remind everybody that he's first and foremost a great filmmaker and not a television producer. And he'll just throw in these scenes that feel much more appropriate to a movie. And so before the show even begins, we see a priest sitting there in the mess hall, and he suddenly dies while eating his meal. And someone says, well, how did he die? Someone essentially states that he died of old age. And like all religions, eventually that'll be what kills the Catholic Church as well. And then it cuts to some scenes or some shots of rotting pews and churches in a state of decay. And it's just a really interesting reminder of the existential threat the Catholic Church is facing in this show, with membership on the decline and influence on the decline. Then, of course, it goes right into the awesome credits, where you have the All on the Watchtower music, which is back this episode. But the big crisis at the beginning of this episode that Lenny is facing while he's talking to Voyello is that revenues are in serious decline because he's not making public appearances, he's not selling touristy propaganda items, and so money is suffering all across the board. And you also have an Italian government that's not necessarily playing ball with friendly tax rates and things like that anymore. And what Voyello is worried about is that with declining revenue and declining church membership, that they might have to start selling some of their art just to keep up with all the expenses they have with the cost of doing business as the Catholic Church. Lenny is less than concerned about the regional bishops suffering. He thinks they can look after themselves, and he does not seem to be alarmed because he seems to feel long-term that people will return to the church in droves. It's just a matter of time. But the big crazy thing we see in this episode is that the adopted brother of Lenny, Cardinal Dussolier, has been indulging in a pretty kinky bisexual menage a trois affair in Honduras, where he's been working for the last few years. And we see him having a pretty aggressive sex scene with these two individuals. And then we see him saying goodbye to his congregation. And it seems like his two sexual partners seem genuinely sad to see him go. But he's going to be moving to the Vatican to work full time. But this character continues to get additional wrinkles and dimensions that make him all the more interesting, especially when Lenny says one of his new proclamations is that he's going to be using these outdated Rorschach tests to determine the sexual leanings of potential priests. And Dussolier tells him that he's really not comfortable with that, and he totally disagrees with it. But Lenny tells him that he will obey and he will implement these new tests, which ends up leading to a young candidate being declined, even though he claims not to be homosexual. More to come on that toward the end of this little video. We also see that Esther has finally had a baby. Whether or not that's due to Lenny creating a miracle or not, who knows? But you have a really uncomfortable scene where he visits her in the hospital. He gives her a Bible that belonged to Thomas Jefferson, and he jokes about how it was never opened. He's holding the baby, and he gets distracted when someone says that the Italian prime minister is waiting for him, and as he spins, he essentially drops the baby. The baby's unharmed, lands on a bed, but you can just tell that Lenny is totally, completely ill-equipped to be dealing with a child, one who is actually named after him. They named the baby Pius, and he jokingly refers to it as Pius the 14th. So we have a very strange situation still there with Esther, but at least for the time being, it seems that her prayers have been answered. But the big confrontation of this episode is between the Italian prime minister and Lenny. And Lenny strolls into this meeting with all the confidence in the world. He's wearing sunglasses, and he's got his full attire, and the Prime Minister is also really confident. They're both young, they're both successful, and the Prime Minister won with 41% of the Italian electorate, which is pretty huge in Italy because they have a lot of political parties. And he essentially says that when it comes to dealing with the church, that because membership is on the wane and interest is on the wane, that the church will no longer have the ability to kind of throw its weight around in Italian politics. And so they're going to be doing things like common law marriages and gay marriage, and they're going to have much tougher tax rates on the church. And he's planning on doing all these things, essentially kind of going to war with the Catholic Church. And Lenny, and probably the best scene he's had so far in the season, I mean, Jude Law just oozes confidence in this episode, and he essentially says that he's way smarter and way better looking, and that basically he has a list of demands, and that he essentially threatens the prime minister that 41% that he's so proud of will completely disintegrate if he doesn't play ball with the Catholic Church. Because what he threatens to do is to bring back this idea or this statement, non expedite, which in Latin essentially means no voting, or something to that effect. But essentially it would be a decree by the Catholic Church that all Italian Catholics should refrain from voting in elections until they are told otherwise. While not everybody would obey, while not everybody's Catholic who lives in Italy, enough people would obey that the prime minister would essentially lose his power. It'll be interesting to see to what extent the prime minister plays along, because he immediately goes on TV and proclaims Lenny to be a saint. On the other hand, he also says that he will not be doing any of the things that Lenny asked for. Like, Lenny even wants to revisit where the borders of the Vatican are relative to the rest of Italy around it. So we'll see what happens, but Lenny seems very, very confident that he's going to win this little struggle. Vogliello offers to intervene with his political connections, but Lenny turns him down. But Vogliello gets another great scene in this, because the cops come to visit him, and he thinks it's about something totally unrelated. And as they're walking around his office, he's showing off all the books that have been written about him, and he's offering to lend a book to the cop, and the cop takes one about all the famous people that have been blackmailed and manipulated by Vogliello in the past. And Vogliello thinks that the cop's there because he was in a bar or a restaurant recently, and he got in a screaming match with somebody who claimed that Maradona is still on drugs, very, very famous soccer player that Vogliello is obsessed with. The cop's not there for that at all. The cop's there because the guy with the stigmata that was being threatened and or strong-armed at the end of episode 5 has gone missing. And he apparently told his family that he was threatened with being thrown into quicksand if he didn't back off of his attempts to essentially be recognized by the Catholic Church. And so the cop is basically trying to figure out to what extent Vogliello may or may not be involved with the shepherd's disappearance. And Vogliello very cleverly answers each and every question in a way that would basically remove any sort of suspicion from him. But as the cop is walking out, he decides to get the last word, and he says he has a friend who works in the intelligence bureau over in Dubai, and that he has confirmed that Maradona is in fact still on drugs. And Vogliello, who has great moments in every episode, has one of his best, and he says, "Captain, why do you want to hurt me? Why?" And it's so funny. It's all done in Italian, and the humor of the show gets me every time. But there's also some crazy sexuality. I mean, there's a great flashback of Sister Mary when she's goofing around on the basketball court, and she's shooting hoops, pulling off her headdress and kind of shaking her hair around and everything. And all the boys at the orphanage are just sitting around with their jaws hanging open, just openly salivating, looking at this girl that they're all completely obsessed with. And then it cuts back to the present day where Sister Mary is an older woman, and she still enjoys shooting hoops. And you can see that Lenny and his foster brother still have some sort of lingering attraction for her from when they were their kids growing up. Just a great little moment for the episode to exhale and relax before we get to the conclusion. There's a really, really interesting scene where we see Dussolier is eating by himself, and these older but obviously very, very wealthy and attractive women basically are sizing him up, looking at him almost like he's a piece of chicken, and they are inviting him to some fancy party at some villa. And, one girl's doing all the talking, and her friend's kind of hanging back and just watching. And you can tell there's just nothing but lust and desire in their eyes. And I guess the impression is that Dussolier remains very sexually active, as we saw, obviously, at the beginning of the episode. But then he has a very, very sad confrontation with the kid who was turned down from becoming a priest. Kid comes up, throws a drink in his face, and Dussolier tries to comfort him. But soon thereafter, we see that the kid commits suicide. So it's a very sad, somber ending to the episode. It doesn't end on any major cliffhanger, any major event, which is why I say that episode 5 was the stronger episode of the two. But it was still a riveting episode, and I can't wait to watch episode 7 in a few days' time. So, hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you're enjoying the show. I've been loving all the comments I've been getting on the previous videos. Seems like there are a lot of people out there who love the show, but are frustrated by the fact that too few people are willing to give it a try. And so, yeah, I'm just happy to play a small role in convincing some people perhaps to take a crack at it, because I think right now it's one of the best things you can find on television, hands down. So, thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back at y'all in the near future. So long.